Hi guys, so how do INFJs relate to the dimension of control? Control and INFJs, I mean, that is an interesting question. Asked, I believe, by Sales Drive, so I thank her for that, as I'm always grateful for all her interesting questions and the interesting questions that other people have been asking. Please don't hesitate to ask questions. These are great cues for the development of my thinking and for me to think of videos to produce and to have these kinds of very direct and somewhat intimate, it's actually intimate, interactions with you. Now that that's been said, second thing before I move to the subject of control. Some of you may know, I've discussed this with my patrons on Patreon, but I'm currently undergoing training to become a qualified psychoanalytic psychotherapist. Right? So I'll be, in a sense, an expert on INFJs and maybe INFJs and INTJs eventually, and with interesting insights to share on type in general. But I'll also obviously have the added skill of having a lot of philosophical training that's been visible on my channel for a while, but I'm increasingly becoming literate in psychoanalytic literature as well, and I'll be hopefully by September 2026 I'll be able to practice as a psychotherapist. Anyway, that's just a way of saying that it's not about bragging. It's a way of saying that some of what I'm going to say here, and perhaps increasingly in my future videos, is going to be informed not just by philosophy, but by psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, which I think is super interesting, because let's not forget that Jung himself was a psychoanalyst, right? So, INFJs and control. What is the relationship that INFJs have with control? Control of what? You know, this is the first question that we need to ask, right? Control of what? There's control of others and control of yourself and your immediate bodily and psychic environment, okay? So, what I have almost exclusively found in INFJs I've interacted with, observed, or whose writings I've read, is that INFJs are not controlling of others. They're not controlling types in that sense. It's really something that I've almost never seen. It seems there is a real correlation here between being an INFJ and not being controlling of others. It does have a relationship between, or rather with, the particular quality of INFJ FE. I've mentioned in videos before, and I'm sure I will mention in videos in the future, that INFJs tend to have introjective FE, sort of hold sway over projective FE. So that's also part of the key to INFJ empathy and the INFJ ability to be chameleon-like, either in positive or sometimes less positive, less healthy ways. But introjective FE is the quality of making part of you what are the norms and values and modes of organization and beliefs of a particular tribe, okay? Now, of course, not being completely invaded by that level of introjection is also going to be important, because you don't want to become the puppet or the puppet of a particular group, particular tribe, and that happens. When you encounter INFJ fanatics, and that does happen, we have to come to terms with the fact that it does happen. We have a prime example here of INFJs whose ego, through introjective FE, has been completely taken over by the group, by the tribe, their beliefs, their norms, their mode of organization, their values. That's where the notion of control, in terms of self-directed control of one's body and one's immediate environment, psychic and physical, becomes very meaningful when it comes to describing what INFJ life is like. Because you will often meet INFJs who are quite controlling of this particular side of them. Particularly those INFJs who are not spiritual INFJs, right? The ones that are good enough in the sense of having had good enough parenting. It's also not a distinctive feature of spiritualized INFJs, because spiritualized INFJs have gotten to a stage of individuation where they no longer feel threatened by introjection, and they even dabble in a bit of projection, projective FE that is, not projection in the defense mechanism, but projective FE. But when we're talking about adaptive INFJs, adaptive submissive that is, or solipsistic INFJs, we're talking about INFJs that, according to my particular theory anyway, have not necessarily had good enough parenting and who have had troubled childhoods in some way or other, both objectively experienced and subjectively experienced, and as a result have had, if you like, a dimension of ego development that is not completed. And that's also why I think there's a strong correlation between these INFJs and Enneagram 6. Of course, not always, but often enough. So if your ego is vulnerable, we're not talking about having a massive ego or a very, very sort of tiny ego. We're talking about just how constructed it is, how structured it is. The ego of these INFJs is not completed, is not quite structured enough to feel comfortable in the presence of other people who are, as a group, manifesting, right, bringing to life values, norms, modes of organization, and belief. So these INFJs are aware of a certain danger to their sense of self, to their ego organization, of introjection itself. Because, and in some sense, they know that being exposed to that phenomenon might actually dissolve their identity. And so they protect themselves. And that's what they're trying to control. The control in the case of the adaptive is very different from the control in the case of the solipsist, of course. The adaptive tends to control through pretense, playing a game, wearing a mask, mixing their self and their persona together. So they are eager to get along with other people, and they use some of their INFJ resources to give people the impression that they are just tagging along. But in a sense, they're protecting themselves and are not, except in those cases of fanaticism, which does happen. Well, the adaptive submissive INFJ is aware of that danger at some level, and more generally of the danger of the annihilation of their identity. And so they protect themselves by pretending that they're in agreement with the group. That poses another problem, which is that of authenticity, and that I've covered recently regarding INFJs and INTJs. But that's the idea. The control is exercised through dissimulation and pretense. In the case of the solipsistic INFJ, the control is more visible physically. It's mostly done through withdrawal and rejection of the worth that other social groups, or sometimes just most other people, have. They pride themselves on being solitary and independent, and that is their mode of control. Here, the mode of control has both a psychical and physical component that you will not necessarily identify in the case of the adaptive, where the control is more sort of psychical. Physically speaking, they do mix with others and so on, whereas the solipsist doesn't. Once you enter into a path of spiritualization, like the basic idea here is that the spiritualized INFJ has managed to repair their damaged ego. Right? And whole books could be written about this process. But the idea is that they have managed to come to terms with the vulnerability of their ego, care for it, repair it, build more organization and structure into it. From the moment that that happens and is accomplished at some level, the group stops being so threatening. The external environment stops being so threatening, and control is relinquished to a great degree. Either control in the form of dissimulation and pretense, or control in terms of withdrawal. As for the spiritual INFJ, the question does not really arise, because again, that INFJ has a good enough ego to begin with. Okay? Let me know in the comments what you think, guys. Drop me a like if you enjoyed that video. Don't forget, I have written 2 books on the INFJ, quite in-depth investigation of INFJ life in the modern world, often seen as hostile to INFJs, but how to remain authentic and still thrive in terms of values, meaning, purpose. This is a book to get, guys. Check the link below if you're interested in learning much more about INFJ in the world. It's a good, it's pretty good. Check the reviews as well. The prequel is called The Ecstatic Soul, and that's much more about the INFJ mind and its existential manifestations, the deepest investigation of INFJ consciousness, The Ecstatic Soul. 2 books go very well together, and as usual, as you know, my Patreon page is alive below my channel. Please consider donating at the links below. You can access bonus content like in-depth discussions of topics I discuss here in the mainstream YouTube channel or in my books. Ongoing research where I'm also interacting, asking for people's feedback. So there's quite an intimate intellectual relationship happening on Patreon. You can suggest video content, you get priority for this, and generally take part in the community. So please consider it, guys. I would appreciate it. The link is below, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.